In the spring of 1847, when the world still believed in things that breathed beneath still waters, there stood a church by a river that never forgot. Saint Bartholomew rose from the banks of what the old maps called the Father's Vein, though most folks in Dovermount had long since forgotten why. The church was built of dark stone that wept in the rain, its spire piercing the mist like a finger pressed to unwilling lips, silent, waiting. And beside it, the river moved with a patience that suggested it had all the time in the world to collect what it was owed. The townspeople whispered that the water had memories, not the kind that fades with seasons or softens with time, but the sharp, cutting memory of a blade that knows every throat it has opened. They said the river remembered every soul that had ever touched its depths, every prayer that had ever been whispered above its surface, every secret that had ever been confessed to its endless, listening current. On this particular spring night, 58 men stood in the shadow of St. Bartholomew's Sea, their faces pale in the moonlight that filtered through the reaching branches of willows that grew too close to the water's edge. They were workers mostly, men with calloused hands and bent backs, who had come seeking something the world had worn thin in them. Wanderers too, drawn by whispers of salvation that had spread through the townships like smoke from a distant fire. Father Matthias Rourke moved among them like a scarecrow given a terrible life. His frame was gaunt, stretched thin over sharp bones that seemed to press against his skin from within. His eyes held the fevered brightness of a man who had stared too long into deep water and seen something staring back. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of stones settling in still pools. "Tonight," he intoned, his words drifting across the gathered men like mist, "you shall be cleansed of more than sin. Tonight, you shall be made pure enough for the Father's vein to know you, to claim you, to keep you safe in its embrace." Among the 58 stood Thomas Hale, a school teacher whose faith had grown as fragile as autumn leaves. His journal, pressed close to his chest, contained doubts he dared not speak aloud. He had come seeking redemption for failures that gnawed at him in the dark hours before dawn, students he could not save, lessons he could not teach, a God who seemed to grow more distant with each passing day. But standing here with the river's breath cold against his face, those doubts crystallized into something harder and more cutting than fear. Beside him, Elijah Brand shifted his weight from foot to foot, his aged bones protesting the night's chill. Elijah remembered. He remembered when the church had been shuttered before, when the doors had been sealed with iron and prayer and desperate hope. He remembered the whispers of drowned choirs and buried bells, of hymns that rose from beneath the floorboards when no throat sang them. Most of all, he remembered the last time the church had drunk the river, as the old-timers used to say, their voices dropping to whispers that barely disturbed the air. 60 years passed. Elijah had told anyone who would listen, though fewer listened each year. 60 years since the choir boys went under. 12 of them, sweet voices all, found floating in the loft with lungs full of silt. But the river never rose, never touched the building. The water came from somewhere else entirely. The other men paid him little mind. They had come for salvation, not stories. They filed through the church doors with the resigned determination of cattle moving towards slaughter, their boots echoing against stones that seemed to drink up sound and warmth alike. The air inside tasted of brine and old prayers, of incense that had turned sour with age, and something underneath it all, something that made the back of the throat close and the lungs labor for each breath. As the last man crossed the threshold, the townspeople who had gathered to watch began to drift away. This was not their ceremony. Custom dictated that they remain outside, barred from witnessing what would unfold within those walls. This was baptism, but not for the people of Dovermount. This was baptism for the river itself, an offering made in darkness to waters that had grown hungry in the 60 years since they had last been fed. The great oak doors swung closed with a sound like breaking bones. The lock clicked with the finality of a coffin lid settling into place, and silence, deep, pressing silence, spread over Dovermount, like a shroud pulled tight. Inside the church, Thomas pressed his hand to his journal and felt the leather grow damp beneath his palm. The temperature had dropped until his breath misted in the air, and somewhere in the walls he could swear he heard the sound of water moving. Not flowing, but moving with purpose, with intelligence, like something vast and patient stirring in the depths. Father Matthias took his place before the altar, his arms spread wide in supplication. "The Father's vein calls to its children," he proclaimed, his voice echoing strangely in the vaulted space. "Let us answer." Hours passed. The moon tracked its course across the sky, while Dove-Mount held its breath. Then, at the stroke of midnight, the bells began to toll. But there was no one in the bell tower to ring them. The sound rolled across the sleeping town like thunder, made of brass and shadow. It spoke of depths unsealed and hungers long denied. It spoke of 58 men who had sought salvation and found something else entirely waiting in the darkness between prayer and drowning. When dawn broke grey and reluctant over Dove-Mount, the townspeople gathered once more before St. Bartholomew Seh. The doors stood closed, sealed still by whatever power had locked them in the night, but something had changed. The stones wept more freely now, and the air around the building tasted of salt and sorrow. They forced the doors with crowbars and desperate strength, and what they found inside defied every law of nature and God they thought they knew. Water stains lapped the pews like tide marks, dark and glistening in the morning light. The floorboards dripped with river silt, thick and black and smelling of things that had been underwater far too long. And there, arranged in perfect rows as if they had simply laid down to sleep, were all 58 men. They were pale as winter morning, their skin bloated and soft like flesh that had spent days beneath still water. Their mouths hung open as if they had died, gasping for air that would not come, and their eyes stared sightlessly at the vaulted ceiling where no watermarks showed. River weeds tangled in their hair, shells nested in their pockets. Their lungs, when the doctor finally worked up courage to examine them, were full of water that had never seen the light of day. But here was the thing that stopped every heart and stilled every tongue. The church was dry. Not a drop of water remained within those walls. The stains were there, yes, and the smell of brine and depths, but no puddle, no pool, no source from which such a flood might have come. It was as if the water had done its work and simply vanished, leaving only the dead and the stench of the river that had never entered. Father Matthias was found among them, but unlike the others, he breathed still. His clothes were soaked through, clinging to his thin frame like grave wrappings, but his eyes burned with that same fevered brightness. When questioned, he claimed no memory of the night's events, only fragments, the sound of hymns sung in voices not quite human, the taste of salt on his tongue, the sensation of drowning while breathing air. "They have been cleansed," he whispered, his voice hoarse as if he had been screaming for hours. Cleansed too deeply to remain. The town was left with one question that would haunt their days and poison their dreams. How can men drown where no river touched? But perhaps, in the deep places of their hearts where fear lived alongside faith, they already knew the answer. Perhaps they had always known that some thirsts cannot be quenched with earthly water, and some hunger demands more than flesh and blood. Perhaps they understood, in ways they dared not speak aloud, that the Father's vein had finally remembered how to feed. And now, as you sit listening to this tale, feeling the weight of shadows gathering at the edges of your vision, you must ask yourself what lies beneath the still waters of your own faith. What hungers might be stirring in the depths of your own certainty, waiting for the right moment to rise and claim what they have always considered theirs. The church bells have stopped ringing, but somewhere in the spaces between heartbeats, can you hear the sound of something vast and patient, breathing? The funerals came swift as plague wind, mass graves opened like wounds in the earth that bled shadow instead of blood. 58 coffins lowered without ceremony, without the comfort of final words or gentle hymns. The families wept, but their tears fell in silence, as if sound itself had become dangerous in Dovermount, as if speaking might wake something that had only just settled back into the depths of its long dreaming. This silence was not born of grief alone. It was tradition, carved deep as riverbed stone into the bones of the town. When the father's vein took its due, the living kept their mouths shut and their questions swallowed. But traditions, like rivers, can only hold back so much before they overflow their banks. The whispers began in the spaces between official prayers. They crept through the market square like water seeping through cracks in a foundation. How could 58 men drown in a church that never saw flood? How could lungs fill with river water that left no trace of its presence? And why? This question came softest of all, breathed only in the dark corners where eyes could not follow. Why was Father Matthias the only one to survive? The priest himself offered no comfort to the questioning hearts of his flock. He moved through the days that followed like a man walking underwater, his movements slow and deliberate, his words carefully chosen and sparse as winter grain. When pressed for answers, he would only repeat the same refrain: "They have been cleansed too deeply to remain." But his clothes stayed damp no matter how long he wore them, and his eyes held the glassy sheen of a man who had seen the bottom of something too deep to measure. Margaret Hale clutched her husband's journal like a drowning woman might clutch driftwood. The leather cover had warped with moisture it had never touched, the pages within rippling as if they had been submerged and carefully dried. Most of Thomas's final entry remained legible, his careful schoolteacher's script marching across the page in neat, precise lines. But the last sentence, the last words her husband had ever written, trailed off into ink that had run like tears. "The water is rising," she read aloud to the empty kitchen, her voice breaking on each word, "though no one opens the doors." The sentence ended there, the ink spreading into a dark stain that looked disturbingly like the watermarks they had found in the church, as if the page itself had choked on whatever Thomas had been trying to say. Margaret had been married to Thomas for 7 years, and she knew his handwriting, as well as she knew the sound of his breathing in the dark hours before dawn. These were his words written in his hand. But the ink was wrong. It held the green-black tint of river water, thick with sediment and secrets. When she brought her concerns to Elijah Brand, the old man's face went white as church candles. He sat her down in his kitchen, poured 2 cups of tea that neither of them would touch, and told her things that should have been buried with the men who remembered them. This was not the first time, he said, his voice barely rising above the whisper of wind through dried leaves. In 1791, the church choir, 12 boys with voices sweet as summer rain, were found drowned in the loft. Their lungs full of river silt, their mouths opened in perfect circles as if they had died singing. But there was no flood that year. No storm, no overflow. The river ran calm as glass throughout that autumn. He paused, his gnarled hands trembling as they wrapped around his untouched cup. They hushed it then, buried it under prayer and stone, and the desperate hope that some things are better left unspoken. The church was shuttered for 10 years after. The doors were sealed with iron blessed by 3 separate bishops, and when they opened it again, they said the evil had been cleansed. But it wasn't, Margaret said, and it was not a question. "No," Elijah whispered, "it was only sleeping." The old man leaned forward, his eyes bright with the fever of secrets long held. "Your husband wasn't the only one to leave a record. I found papers in my father's things after he passed. Letters from the town fathers, reports they thought no one would ever read. Do you know what they called Father Matthias in those documents?" Margaret shook her head, though something cold was already settling in her stomach. "Not a priest," Elijah said. "Warden. They called him the Warden of St. Bartholomew Sen, and his duty, according to those papers, was not salvation." He paused, the weight of unspoken truth hanging heavy between them. His duty was sealing. That night, Margaret dreamed of Thomas. He stood in their bedroom doorway, water streaming from his clothes, his mouth moving in words she could not hear. Behind him, the hallway stretched longer than it should, filled with a mist that tasted of brine and old prayers. When she woke, her pillow was damp with tears she did not remember shedding, and the floorboards around her bed were dark with moisture that had no earthly source. The divide in Dovemount grew deeper with each passing day. Some families packed their belongings and left for distant towns, unwilling to remain in a place where rivers could drown men through solid stone. Others clung more desperately to the church, as if proximity to the scene of the miracle, for that was what they insisted on calling it, might protect them from whatever had claimed the 58. But all of them, believer and skeptic alike, began to notice the doors. It started small, as these things do, a door that stuck when it should have opened easily. A latch that seemed heavier than it had the day before, hinges that creaked with the sound of something settling deeper into the wood. But soon the problem spread like rot through the entire town. Doors swelled with moisture they had never touched. They warped and buckled, fighting against their frames as if something was pressing against them from the other side. Families found themselves trapped in their own homes, forced to break down barriers that had stood without issue for decades. The wood, when split, revealed cores that were dark and damp, riddled with patterns that looked disturbingly like the grain found in timber that had spent years underwater. Samuel Whitcroft, whose brother David had been among the 58, reported the strangest occurrence of all. Each morning, he found wet footprints leading from his front door to his bedroom, though no one living had walked that path. The prints were the size of David's feet, the same distinctive pattern worn into the sole of his left boot from a childhood injury. But the water that made them carried no scent of rain or well water. It smelled of depths and darkness, of places where sunlight had never penetrated. "It's like he's trying to come home," Samuel whispered to Margaret when she came to hear his account. "Like death isn't quite enough to keep him away." But the most disturbing discovery came from Mrs. Eleanor Cray, whose son had been the youngest of the drowned men. She reported wet handprints on her windows each morning, pressed against the glass from the outside. The prints were small, delicate, exactly the size of her boy's hands. But when she looked closer, she saw that the moisture was not water at all. It was salt, crystalline and pure, as if tears had been pressed against the glass and left to dry in perfect outline. Through it all, Father Matthias continued his duties with mechanical precision. He rang the church bells each morning and evening, though the sound had taken on a hollow, underwater quality that made listeners feel as if they were drowning in air. He delivered sermons to congregations that grew smaller each week, his words echoing in the empty pews like voices calling across vast distances. But his message never changed. When questioned about the deaths, about the water that had appeared and vanished, about the doors that would no longer open properly, he would spread his thin arms and proclaim with fevered certainty, "They are not lost, they are sealed, safe in the embrace of something greater than the corruption of this world." And when the last questioner had left and the church stood empty in the gathering dusk, he would lock the great oak doors and stand alone in the nave, listening to sounds that came from beneath the floorboards. Sounds like hymns sung in voices that bubbled with water, like prayers offered by throats that no longer needed air. The people of Dovemount learned to avoid looking too closely at the church after dark, because sometimes in the spaces between the tolling of the bells, they could swear they saw lights moving behind the stained glass windows, not the warm, steady glow of candles, but something that flickered and wavered like sunlight filtering down through deep water. And sometimes, if the wind was just right and the night was still enough, they could hear singing. Voices raised in harmony, 58 strong, echoing up from somewhere far below the foundations of St. Bartholomew's Sex. The dead, it seemed, had found their voices again, but what they sang and why they sang it remained a mystery that grew deeper and more threatening with each passing day. For in the end, the most terrifying question was not how the men had drowned. It was whether they were truly dead at all. 3 weeks after the drowning, Margaret Hale stood before the rectory door with Thomas's journal pressed against her chest like armor against the dark. The morning mist clung to her skirts, and somewhere in the distance the church bells tolled with their new, waterlogged voice. Each note seemed to sink into the air rather than rise, as if the sound itself was drowning. The rectory door, like so many others in Dovemount, had begun to swell. Margaret had to throw her shoulder against it twice before it yielded, opening with a groan that sounded disturbingly like something surfacing from deep water. Inside, the air tasted of salt and secrets, and Father Matthias sat at his desk like a scarecrow forgotten in winter fields. "I want to know who locked the church doors that night," Margaret said without preamble. Her grief had crystallized into something harder than tears, sharper than accusations. "I want to know why 58 men were sealed inside like animals in a trap." Father Matthias looked up from papers that seemed to dampen under his touch. His eyes held that same fevered brightness that had burned there since the night of the drowning, but now there was something else beneath it, something that might have been fear. "The river locks what it claims," he said, his voice carrying the weight of water over stone. "I am but the instrument of deeper currents." "That's not an answer." "It is the only answer I have." His hands trembled as he set down his pen, and Margaret noticed that the ink on the papers had the same green-black tint as the stain in Thomas's journal. "The deaths were divine mercy, Mrs. Hale. Your husband and the others have been spared the corruption that awaits us all." But his trembling hands betrayed him. Whatever Father Matthias had seen that night, whatever he had done or allowed to be done, it had carved fear into his bones deep as marrow. Margaret left the rectory, more determined than before. If the priest would not give her answers, she would find them elsewhere. She sought out Elijah Brand in his cottage by the mill stream, where the old man spent his days carving whittling projects that always seemed to take the shape of small boats. "Tell me about the locks," she demanded. Elijah set down his knife and wood shavings, his ancient eyes studying her face with the intensity of a man reading prophecy in tea leaves. "You're sure you want to know? Some knowledge is a burden that only grows heavier with time." "I'm sure." The old man nodded slowly. "I was 7 years old when they forged those locks, not made forged. There's a difference, though most folks wouldn't know it. The blacksmith who made them was a man named Jeremiah Thorne, and he didn't work alone. There were others, men who called themselves river masons, who claimed they could work metal the way others worked wood or stone." He paused, his gnarled fingers tracing patterns in the wood shavings that reminded Margaret uncomfortably of the water stains in the church. "They made the locks from iron pulled from the riverbed itself, iron that had been underwater so long it had forgotten what it meant to be dry. And while they worked, they sang. Not hymns, mind you, but something older, something that made the water in the well rise and the fish swim upstream in the middle of summer." "What happened to them?" "These river masons." Elijah's face went gray as the winter sky. "They drowned before the work was finished. All of them found floating in the shallows with their lungs full of silt and their tools still clutched in their hands. But the locks," he shook his head. "The locks were completed anyway, sitting on the forge table like they had made themselves." That evening, Margaret found herself walking to the church as if drawn by invisible currents. The building loomed against the darkening sky, its stone walls weeping more freely than ever. As she approached the great oak doors, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The locks were wet. Not damp from the evening mist, but actively dripping, as if they had just been pulled from the bottom of a deep pool. And the wood around them had begun to change, taking on the green-black patina of timber that had spent decades underwater. She reached out to touch one of the locks, then jerked her hand back as the metal burned cold against her fingertips. For just a moment, she could have sworn she heard voices coming from within the church, not the voices of the living, but something else, something that gurgled and bubbled as it sang. Samuel Whitcroft found her there, standing transfixed before the sealed doors, His face was haggard, his eyes bloodshot from nights spent lying awake listening to his dead brother's footsteps pacing the hall. "They can't be opened from the inside," he said without greeting. "The masons tried yesterday, pried and hammered and cursed until their voices gave out, but the wood fights back." He led her around to the side of the building, where fresh scars marked the stone foundation. "Look here. They tried to break through the wall when the doors wouldn't yield, but watch this." He pressed his hand against one of the scars, and Margaret gasped as water began to seep from the stone. Not a trickle, but a steady flow that should have been impossible from solid rock. "The more they scrape, the wetter everything becomes," Samuel continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yesterday Thomas Carpenter fell ill. After working on the wall for 3 hours, they started coughing up fluid. They said, fluid that tasted of brine and things that had been dead a long time." That night Margaret dreamed again of Thomas. But this dream was different, more vivid, more real than anything she had experienced since his death. He stood in the nave of St. Bartholomew Sens, his body floating in air as if he were suspended in invisible water. His mouth moved in words she could not hear, but his eyes, his beautiful, kind eyes, were filled with a terror so profound it made her heart stop. Behind him she could see the other men, all 58 of them, floating in the same impossible manner. Their arms moved in slow, graceful motions, as if they were swimming through thick liquid. Their mouths were open in perfect circles, as if they were singing hymns to something vast and patient that listened from the depths. She woke up gasping, her mouth filled with the taste of river silt, though no water had passed her lips. The taste lingered for hours, metallic and ancient, like blood that had been mixed with mud from the bottom of a very deep well. The next day brought news that divided Dovemount even further. 3 families had abandoned their homes in the night, leaving behind possessions and memories in their desperate flight from the town. But 5 others had moved closer to the church, setting up temporary shelters in the rectory garden, as if proximity to the sealed building might offer protection from whatever had claimed the 58. The believers spoke of divine intervention, of a miracle that had saved the chosen few from the corruption of the world. They knelt in the damp grass before the church doors, pressing their lips to wood that wept with moisture that never dried, begging for inclusion in whatever salvation the drowned men had found. The skeptics whispered of darker things. They spoke of curses and hauntings, of waters that moved with intelligence and purpose. They avoided the church entirely, crossing themselves when they had to pass near its shadow, hurrying their children along with warnings about places where the earth itself had grown hungry. But both groups agreed on one thing. The doors of St. Bartholomew's would never open again, not by human hands, not by earthly tools. Whatever lay within those walls was sealed by something deeper than iron and stronger than prayer. Father Matthias continued his midnight vigils, standing alone in the garden while the church bells tolled without hands to ring them. When questioned about his solitary watches, he would only smile with the beatific expression of a man who had seen the face of God and found it beautiful beyond description. "They are not lost," he would repeat, his voice carrying across the night air like ripples on still water. "They are sealed, safe in the embrace of depths that know no corruption, no decay, no death." And sometimes, in the hour before dawn, when the mist rose thick from the Father's vein, the townspeople would see him kneeling before the sealed doors, his hands pressed against the weeping wood, his lips moving in prayers that seemed to make the very air around him shimmer and bend. But what they could not see, what only Father Matthias knew in the depths of his fevered soul, was that the doors were not locked to keep the world out. They were locked to keep something in. Something that grew stronger with each passing day, something that fed on the hymns of the drowned and the faith of the living, something that had been sleeping in the depths of the Father's vein for 60 years, waiting for the right moment to wake. And now, as the locks wept their impossible tears and the wood swelled with moisture from places beyond the reach of rain, that moment was drawing near. The father's vein began to remember in earnest as April bled into May. It remembered the taste of 58 souls, remembered the weight of their final breaths, remembered the way their voices had joined the ancient hymn that rose from its deepest places, and in remembering, it grew restless. Samuel Whitcroft was the first to notice the changes in his nets. Where once he had pulled silver-scaled fish from the dark water, now he hauled up things that should have remained buried in river mud. Bones white as church candles, worn smooth by currents that had polished them for decades. Fragments of timber that bore the marks of tools no living craftsman remembered how to use. And once, tangled in the hemp like some obscene gift, a child's shoe that had not seen the light of day since the year of the drowned choir. "The river's giving up its secrets," Samuel told Margaret when she came to examine his grim catch. "Things that should have stayed buried are floating to the surface." But it was not just objects the water released. The children of Dovemount, playing too close to the banks despite their parents' warnings, reported hearing hymns in the current, not the familiar songs of Sunday morning, but melodies that seemed to flow upstream, defying the natural order of things. The music was beautiful and terrible, they said, beautiful enough to make them weep, terrible enough to make them run. Mrs. Eleanor Cray, whose son had been the youngest of the drowned, found her boy standing at the water's edge 3 nights running. Not the living boy, who lay sealed behind the weeping doors of St. Bartholomew's Say, but something else. Something that wore his face and sang with his voice but cast no reflection in the moonlit water. "Come home, mother," the thing that looked like her son would call across the distance. "Come home to the hymn." But when she ran toward the voice, she found only an empty shore and the lingering scent of brine that had no business so far from the sea. The manifestations grew bolder as the days passed. Lanterns left burning on porches would flicker and die when the mist rose from the river, extinguished by invisible hands. Dogs refused to cross bridges after dark, hackles raised and whimpering at sounds only they could hear. And in the deepest part of the night, when the moon hid behind clouds and the world held its breath, the dead walked. Margaret saw them first from her bedroom window, 58 figures moving in perfect formation along the riverbank. They wore the faces of the men who had drowned, but their movements were wrong, too fluid, too graceful, like beings accustomed to moving through water rather than air. Their mouths moved in unison, forming words in a language that predated human speech, and wherever their feet touched the ground, the earth grew dark and damp. The sight should have filled her with terror. Instead, she felt a pull so strong it made her hands shake as she gripped the windowsill. They were calling to her, these waterlogged specters of her neighbors and friends, calling her to join them in their midnight procession, to add her voice to their impossible choir. She forced herself to turn away, but the sound of their singing followed her into sleep, into dreams where Thomas reached for her with hands that dripped river water and eyes that reflected depths no living soul had ever seen. By morning, the procession had left its mark. A trail of dampness led from the riverbank to the church doors, where the wood had swollen even further, and the locks wept tears of rust-colored water. The trail continued around the building, spiraling inward like the shell of some vast nautilus, before disappearing at the base of the bell tower. Elijah Brand, examining the pattern with the careful attention of a man who had spent 70 years learning to read the signs, shook his head in dismay. "They're not at peace," he told Margaret, as they traced the spiral path. "The dead should rest, should find their way to whatever lies beyond. But they're bound to something that won't let them go." "What could be strong enough to hold 58 souls?" Margaret asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Something older than the church, older than the town. Something that was here when the first settler drove his stakes into the riverbank and decided this would be a fine place to build a life." He led her to the ruins of the old mill, a half-mile upstream from the church. The building had been abandoned for 20 years, its water wheel frozen by neglect and time. But as they approached, Margaret could hear something that made her blood run cold. the sound of water moving through channels that should have been dry. The mill was the first building in Dovermount, Elijah explained, his voice barely audible above the impossible sound of flowing water. Built right over what the old maps called the heart of the vein. The founder thought he was clever, using the river's power to grind grain and saw timber. But the river had other plans. Inside the ruined mill, the great stones sat silent and still, but beneath them, clearly audible through the cracked floorboards, water rushed with the force of a spring flood. Margaret knelt and pressed her ear to the floor, and gasped at what she heard. Voices, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all singing in harmony that rose and fell like tides. The melody was the same one the children had heard by the riverbank, the same impossible hymn that had followed her into dreams. But here, in this place where the river's heart beat strongest, she could almost make out words. Not English words, not any human language at all, but something older, something that spoke of depths unmeasured and hungers unslaked, of a patience that could wait centuries for the right moment to feed. The land was never meant for sanctuaries, Elijah whispered as they fled the mill, the sound of underground hymns following them like hunting dogs. This whole valley was a marsh once, a place where the river spread wide and shallow and dangerous. The first settlers drained it, built their church and their homes on ground that had been underwater for thousands of years. They thought they were civilizing the wilderness. But you can't civilize water, Margaret. You can only redirect it. That night, the doors throughout Dovermount began to betray their owners in earnest. Samuel woke to find his bedroom door sealed shut, the wood swollen so tight against the frame that no amount of pushing could budge it. He had to break the window and climb out onto the roof, then drop to the ground like a thief escaping his own home. Mrs. Cray discovered her kitchen door standing wide open, though she had locked it carefully before bed. Wet footprints led from the threshold to her son's empty bedroom, where the mattress bore the impression of a body that had lain down while soaking wet. The Carpenter family found themselves trapped in their parlor when every door in the house swelled shut simultaneously. They spent 3 hours hacking their way to freedom with kitchen knives and a rusty saw, and when they finally broke through, the wood was so saturated with moisture it felt like cutting through waterlogged driftwood. But the most disturbing incident involved the Whitmore children, who woke to find their nursery door not just stuck, but weeping. Clear liquid ran down the painted wood in streams, pooling on the floor in patterns that looked disturbingly like the spiral path the dead had left around the church. When their father tasted the liquid, against all wisdom and common sense, he immediately began coughing up water, as if his lungs had suddenly remembered how to drown. Through it all, Father Matthias continued his vigils, standing guard over the sealed church like a sentinel at the gates of paradise. When confronted about the strange occurrences, about the dead who walked and the doors that wept, he would only smile with that beatific expression that never quite reached his eyes. "They are coming home," he would say, his voice carrying the weight of prophecy. "All of them, in time. The river remembers its children, and it calls them back to the depths where they belong." But Margaret noticed that even the priest's confidence seemed strained. His clothes grew damp each day, as if he were slowly drowning in air. His sermons, delivered to congregations that dwindled like autumn leaves, became increasingly incoherent, filled with references to depths and currents, and the blessed drowning that awaited all who embraced the Father's vein. And sometimes in the hour before dawn, when the mist rose thickest from the water, she saw him standing waist-deep in the river itself, his arms spread wide in supplication, his mouth moving in prayers that made the very air around him shimmer and bend like heat waves rising from sun-baked stone. The river was remembering, yes, but what it remembered most clearly was hunger and the taste of souls that had been offered in the darkness of a sealed church. And with each passing day that hunger grew stronger, more insistent, harder to ignore. Soon Margaret realized with growing dread, the Father's vein would remember how to feed itself. And when that day came, the 58 dead men would not be the last to join the ancient hymn that rose from the depths of the earth. They would only be the beginning. By the first week of June, Dovemount had split like riverbank clay in drought, cracked down the middle by fear and faith in equal measure. The division was visible in every glance, every whispered conversation, every door left barred against neighbors who had once been welcome as family. On one side stood those who had embraced Father Matthias's vision of divine drowning. They gathered each evening in the rectory garden, kneeling before the sealed church doors with their faces turned upward like flowers following the sun. Their prayers rose into the dusk air thick with longing, begging to be included in whatever salvation the 58 had found in the depths. They pressed wilted flowers against the weeping wood and left offerings of salt and silver coins, as if the church had become a shrine to some waterlogged saint. On the other side, huddled the skeptics, the fearful, the ones whose sleep was haunted by the sound of impossible hymns and the sight of their drowned loved ones walking the riverbank in eternal procession. They met in the Copper Kettle Tavern, their voices low and urgent as they planned escapes from a town that had grown as treacherous as quicksand beneath their feet. Margaret found herself caught between the two factions, belonging fully to neither. Her grief had crystallized into something harder than faith and sharper than fear, a determination to understand what had claimed her husband, regardless of the cost. She moved through the divided town like a ghost seeking resolution, searching for answers in the spaces between belief and doubt. It was during one of these searches that the mob found her. She had been examining the church's foundation, running her hands along stones that wept with moisture they had never touched, when a group of believers surrounded her in the gathering dusk. Their faces held the fevered intensity of converts, and their leader, Jonathan Mills, whose son had been among the drowned, clutched a prayer book so tightly his knuckles showed white in the moonlight. "Blasphemer," he hissed, and the word carried like wind across still water. Speaking lies about the blessed dead, questioning the mercy that saved them from corruption. "I only want to understand," Margaret began, but the crowd pressed closer, their voices rising in accusation. "She says they drowned," spat Eleanor Cray, the same woman who had wept over her son's empty bed. "She says they suffered, as if divine mercy could ever bring suffering." "She'll bring another drowning upon us," Mills declared, his prayer book raised like a weapon. "The river is listening, always listening, and her doubts poison the water." Margaret's protest died in her throat as hands reached for her, fingers grasping at her shawl and skirts. The crowd's mood had turned ugly, dangerous, fed by grief that had curdled into fanaticism. She might have been pulled down and trampled under their righteous fury if Samuel Whitcroft had not appeared like an avenging angel, his fishing gaff swinging in wide arcs that sent the believers scrambling backward. "Enough," he roared, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had hauled nets full of the river's secrets and survived to tell the tale. "She's done nothing but ask questions any sensible person would ask, questions you're all too afraid to voice yourselves." The crowd dispersed like morning mist, but not before Mills fixed Margaret with a stare that promised this confrontation was far from over. "The river knows its enemies," he called as he retreated. "It knows those who would deny its mercy." That night, as Margaret sat in her kitchen with the curtains drawn tight and the doors barred against both friend and foe, she felt the weight of isolation settling over her like winter snow. The tea in her cup had grown cold hours ago, but she could not bring herself to move, could not summon the energy to pretend that sleep might bring peace instead of dreams. It was then that the knocking began. Not at the door. That would have been alarming enough, but at the window, soft rhythmic tapping that spoke of fingers grown patient with death, of knuckles that no longer felt the cold. Margaret forced herself to look, and there, pressed against the glass, was Thomas's hand. His palm was pale as fish belly, marked with lines that held the green-black tint of river water. His wedding ring, the simple gold band she had placed on his finger 7 years ago, now bore a patina of rust, and something that looked disturbingly like barnacles. And his eyes, Oh, his beautiful, kind eyes reflected depths that no living soul had ever seen. His mouth moved in words she could not hear through the glass, but she could read his lips well enough. "Join me," he mouthed over and over. "Join me in the hymn." Margaret pressed her own hand against the window, matching her palm to his with only the fragile barrier of glass between them. The contact sent a chill through her bones that had nothing to do with temperature, and everything to do with the realization that the thing wearing her husband's face was not Thomas at all. It was something else, something that had learned to mimic love, but could not quite hide the hunger beneath. She jerked her hand away, and the thing that looked like Thomas smiled with too many teeth before dissolving into mist that tasted of brine and sorrow. The next morning brought news that sent fresh tremors through the fractured town. 3 more families had fled in the night, abandoning homes and possessions in their desperate flight from Dovermount. But their departure was balanced by new arrivals, pilgrims drawn by whispered tales of miraculous drownings and divine mercy found in the depths. These newcomers had the hollow-eyed look of people who had lost everything and sought meaning in the loss. They set up camp in the rectory garden, pressing themselves as close to the sealed church as Father Matthias would allow. Their prayers rose day and night, a constant litany of longing that seemed to make the very air around the building shimmer with expectation. It was Elijah Brand who finally voiced what Margaret had been thinking but dared not say aloud. "This has to end," he told her as they met in secret at the ruins of the old mill. The sound of underground hymns was stronger now, rising through the cracked floorboards with enough force to make the abandoned millstones tremble. "The longer we wait, the stronger it becomes. Soon, it won't need the church at all. It will take the whole town." "What are you suggesting?" The old man's eyes held the grim determination of someone who had seen too much and understood too little, but was willing to act on faith alone. "Fire," he said simply. "The same force that can purify water can sever its connection to unholy things. If we burn the church, we might break whatever holds the dead to this place." Margaret stared at him in shock. "You want to burn down St. Bartholomew's says? I want to save what's left of this town, and maybe if we're very lucky, we might free the souls trapped within those walls." He paused, studying her face in the dim light filtering through the mill's broken windows. "Your husband is still in there, Margaret. Not his body, that's just meat and bone rotting behind sealed doors. But his soul, his essence, whatever you want to call it, that's trapped in the hymn, forced to sing praises to something that feeds on human faith and fear." The plan was simple in its desperation. They would wait for the dark of the moon, when the pilgrims slept deep and Father Matthias retreated to his rectory for his midnight prayers. They would break into the church through one of the windows the masons had weakened, douse the interior with lamp oil, and set the whole structure ablaze before the river's guardians could intervene. But the father's vein had grown clever in its long centuries of feeding. It had learned to listen, to taste fear and determination in the air, like a predator scenting prey. And when Margaret and Elijah crept through the midnight streets with their burden of oil and fire, they found that the church was waiting for them. The windows that had been cracked and vulnerable during the day had sealed themselves shut, the glass flowing like liquid to eliminate any gap that might admit intruders. The stones that had wept moisture now ran with something thicker, something that looked disturbingly like blood in the moonlight. And from within the building came a sound that made their hearts freeze, the voices of 58 dead men, raised in a hymn that shook the very foundations of the earth. They broke the window with an iron bar from the mill, the glass shattering like winter ice under the weight of desperation. Oil splashed across pews that groaned like living things, soaking into wood that had already begun to change, to take on the characteristics of something that had never seen dry land. The first match flared bright as hope, then died as if snuffed by invisible hands. The second lasted long enough to kiss the oil before guttering out in a breath of wind that tasted of deep water and old hymns. But the third, The third caught hold and spread like the wrath of an angry god, racing along the pews and up the walls in sheets of cleansing flame. For a moment, just a moment, Margaret thought they had won. The fire roared with righteous fury, consuming the unholy moisture that had infested the building, driving back the shadows that had grown fat on faith and fear. The hymn faltered, the voices of the dead growing thin and uncertain as the flames reached toward the altar where their mortal forms lay in perfect waterlogged peace. But then the water came. Not from any earthly source, not from broken pipes or leaky roofs, but from the stones themselves. It burst from the walls like blood from opened veins, black and thick and carrying within it the accumulated darkness of centuries. The water rose around their ankles, their knees, their waists, cold as winter night and twice as hungry. The 58 dead men rose with it, their bodies floating in the impossible flood, their mouths open in hymns that turned the fire to steam, and the steam to whispers of things that should never have been spoken. Margaret saw Thomas among them, his school teacher's face serene in death, his hands reaching for her with the patience of something that had all eternity to wait. "Join us," he said, and his voice carried the authority of deep water and older hunger. "Join the hymn, beloved. Let the river remember you as it remembers us." Margaret felt the pull then, the terrible seductive power of the water that promised an end to questions, an end to fear, an end to the crushing weight of loss that had followed her husband's death. It would be so easy to stop fighting, to let the black water fill her lungs and carry her down to whatever depths the dead men called home. But Elijah's hand closed around her wrist, his grip strong despite his advanced years. "No," he gasped, his own voice barely audible above the roar of impossible water. "This is not salvation. This is hunger wearing the mask of mercy." Together they fought toward the window they had broken, swimming through water that had no right to exist, pressing past the reaching hands of the dead, who sang their eternal hymn with lungs full of brine and sorrow. The heat of the dying flames scorched their faces, but the cold of the water was worse, seeping into their bones and whispering of depths unmeasured and patience unlimited. They crashed through the window like newborns, gasping for first breath, tumbling onto the damp grass of the rectory garden where the pilgrims slept through miracles and terrors in equal measure. Behind them the fire died with a hiss that sounded disturbingly like laughter, leaving the church darker and more terrible than ever before. As they lay gasping in the pre-dawn air, Margaret noticed that Elijah's arm, the one that had pulled her from the water, bore marks that had not been there before. His skin was pale and soft, marked with scales that caught the moonlight like scattered coins. And when he breathed, she could hear something liquid rattling in his chest. "The river remembers," he whispered, his voice already taking on the hollow, echoing quality of something spoken through water. "It remembers everyone who touches its depths." Father Matthias emerged from the rectory like a figure from a fever dream, his eyes bright with triumph and terrible joy. He surveyed the scene, the broken window, the failed fire, the pilgrims stirring from sleep, and smiled with the beatific expression of a man whose faith had been vindicated by miracles. "You cannot burn what was baptized in the Father's vein," he declared, his voice carrying across the garden like ripples on still water. "Fire is for the corruption of the world, but water is eternal." And from within the sealed church came the sound of hymns renewed, 58 voices raised in harmony that spoke of depths unmeasured and hungers finally properly fed. Dawn came reluctantly to Dove Mount in the morning after the failed burning, pale and watery, as if the sun itself had been half drowned in the night's terrors. Margaret woke in her own bed with no clear memory of how she had gotten there, her clothes still damp with river water that should not have existed, and her lungs aching as if she had been holding her breath for hours. It was Samuel Whitcroft's pounding on her door that finally roused her to full consciousness, his voice carrying the strain of a man who had seen too much and understood too little. "Margaret, you need to see this. Dear God in heaven, you need to see what's happened." She dressed quickly, her fingers trembling as they worked the buttons of her dress and followed Samuel through streets that had transformed in the darkness. The very ground seemed softer now, more yielding, as if the earth itself had become saturated with moisture from some underground source. And everywhere, scattered like autumn leaves after a storm, were the coffins. 58 of them, split open like seed pods and empty as promises. The graves in the churchyard had burst during the night, disgorging their contents in geysers of black water and river silt. The coffins bobbed in the flooded streets like broken boats, their brass fittings tarnished green and their wood swollen beyond recognition. But the bodies were gone. Where? Margaret whispered, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Walking, Samuel said, his voice barely above a breath. All night they've been walking. The widow Morrison swears she saw her husband standing in her garden, his burial suit streaming with water, his mouth moving as if he were trying to speak. But no sound came out, just bubbles, like he was trying to talk underwater. They made their way through the transformed town, stepping carefully around puddles that reflected no sky, and avoiding the darker patches of ground that seemed to shift and move when observed too closely. Other townspeople emerged from their homes like cautious animals, their faces pale and their eyes wide with the particular horror that comes from seeing the natural order overturned. Mrs. Eleanor Cray met them at the church gates, her hands clutched to her breast, and her voice high with hysteria. "He came to me," she babbled, "my boy, my sweet boy, standing at the foot of my bed with water streaming from his hair. He tried to speak, tried to tell me something, but all that came out was singing. That horrible singing we've been hearing from the river." Margaret took the woman's hands, noting how cold they were, how they trembled like leaves in autumn wind. "What kind of singing, Eleanor? What did it sound like?" "Like hymns, but wrong somehow. Like sacred music played backward, or prayers offered to something that was never meant to receive them." Eleanor's eyes focused on Margaret with desperate intensity. "He was trying to warn me, I think. Trying to tell me not to listen to the song, but his mouth wouldn't make the right words anymore." The revelation sent a chill through Margaret that had nothing to do with the morning air. If the dead were trying to communicate, trying to warn the living against the very power that held them, then perhaps there was still hope. Perhaps some fragment of their true selves remained, trapped but not entirely consumed. She left Eleanor in Samuel's care and made her way to Elijah's cottage, hoping to find the old man recovered from his ordeal in the flooded church. But what she discovered there filled her with dread far deeper than anything she had yet experienced. Elijah sat in his kitchen chair like a man carved from driftwood, his skin pale and soft as something that had been underwater far too long. The scales that had appeared on his arm during the failed burning had spread, creeping up his shoulder and across his chest in patterns that caught the morning light like scattered coins. And when he breathed, the sound was liquid, labored, as if his lungs were slowly filling with something thicker than air. "Margaret," he whispered, and his voice carried the hollow echo of words spoken in deep places. "I can hear them, all of them. The 58, the 12 choir boys from 60 years ago, even others' voices I don't recognize, singing in languages that predate human speech." He turned his head toward her, and she gasped at what she saw in his eyes. They held depth now, reflecting not light, but something else entirely. Something that spoke of vast spaces filled with water and hymns and hungers that had waited centuries to be fed. "They're not gone," he continued, his words bubbling slightly as if forced through liquid. "The dead, I mean. They're still here, still themselves in some small way, but they're bound to the hymn, forced to sing praises to something that feeds on their voices, their faith, their eternal devotion. How do we stop it?" Margaret asked, though she dreaded the answer. Elijah's smile was sad and knowing, touched with the wisdom of someone who had glimpsed the other side of death and found it wanting. "The same way it started, I suspect, with breath, with choice, with someone willing to refuse the song." That afternoon brought Thomas's journal back into Margaret's hands, though she had no memory of retrieving it from her home. The leather binding was soaked through, the pages rippling with moisture that had no earthly source. But as she opened it to the final entry, the words that had trailed off into ink-stained silence, she discovered something that made her heart race with equal parts hope and terror. New words had appeared on the page, words written in Thomas's careful script, but formed from ink that held the green-black tint of deep water. They seemed to flow across the paper, even as she watched, as if the journal itself had become a conduit between the world of the living and whatever depths the dead now called home. Margaret, the words read, appearing letter by letter, like messages sent through vast distances. Do not mourn us. We are not lost, only changed. The song is beautiful and terrible, and once it takes hold, it is impossible to resist. But there is still choice, still a moment before the water fills the lungs completely, when one might refuse. She watched, transfixed. As more words appeared, her husband's voice somehow reaching her through paper and ink, and the impossible gulf between life and death. The church is not the source. It is only the mouth through which the deeper thing feeds. Beneath the altar lies the true heart of the Father's vein, a well that descends beyond measurement. The 58 guard it now, not by choice, but by compulsion. We sing to keep it sealed, but our voices grow weaker with each passing day. Soon, it will break free entirely. The writing paused, the ink seeming to gather itself before forming the final, most crucial message. To stop it, someone must choose silence over song. Someone must descend to the heart of the vein and refuse to add their voice to the hymn. But the choice must be made freely, willingly, or it will have no power over the depths. Margaret closed the journal with trembling hands, understanding at last the true nature of the horror that had claimed her husband and the 57 others. They were not simply dead. They were enslaved, their voices bound to an ancient hunger that fed on faith and devotion. And unless someone was willing to make the ultimate sacrifice, to choose silence over the seductive power of the hymn, that enslavement would spread until it claimed every soul in Dovemount. That evening, as shadows lengthened and the mist began to rise from the Father's vein, the dead came calling in earnest. They walked through the town in procession, 58 figures in waterlogged burial clothes, their mouths moving in perfect unison as they sang the hymn that had bound them to eternal service. But this time, some of the living could hear more than just the terrible music. They could hear words beneath the melody, warnings spoken in voices they recognized and loved. Wives heard their husbands begging them to flee. Children heard their fathers pleading for them to stop their ears against the song. Mothers heard their sons weeping underwater tears as they sang praises to something that had never deserved worship. The procession stopped before each house where the living sheltered, and the dead pressed their faces to windows and doors, their eyes reflecting depths unmeasured as they tried to communicate truths that their voices could no longer speak plainly. Some of the townspeople, driven by love and desperation, opened their doors and reached out to touch the faces of their lost loved ones. Those who made contact fell immediately into the water trance, their eyes taking on the same depthless quality as the dead, their mouths opening to join the eternal hymn. By morning, 12 more souls had been claimed, their bodies floating in the air as if suspended in invisible water, their voices added to the chorus that grew stronger with each new addition. Father Matthias declared it a miracle, a blessing, a sign that the Father's vein was ready to embrace all of its children. He led the remaining pilgrims in prayers of thanksgiving, kneeling before the sealed church as the dead sang their impossible hymns, and the very air around them shimmered with otherworldly power. But Margaret, reading the truth in Thomas's ever-expanding journal entries, knew better. The dead were not praising their captivity, they were warning against it. And time was running out for those who still had the choice to refuse the song. The well beneath the altar was stirring, Thomas wrote that night, his words appearing on pages that had been blank moments before. The deeper thing grows hungry, impatient with the pace of its feeding. Soon, it will rise from the depths where it has slumbered and claim the whole valley. Unless the sentence trailed off, the ink spreading into a dark stain that looked disturbingly like the watermarks they had found in the church after the first drowning. But Margaret understood what her husband could not bring himself to write. Unless someone was willing to descend into those depths and make the choice that would either save Dovemount or damn it forever. The question was, did she have the courage to be that someone? 3 days after the Walking Dead had claimed 12 more souls, Margaret stood before the Church of St. Bartholomew's with Samuel Whitcroft and the slowly transforming Elijah Brand. The old man's condition had worsened, scales now covered half his body, and his breathing had taken on the rhythmic quality of waves against shore. But his mind remained sharp, perhaps sharpened by proximity to whatever dwelt in the depths. The altar, he wheezed, his words bubbling through what might have been water, or might have been something worse. It was never built of stone, river rock, yes, but held together with mortar, made from ground bone and mixed with silt from the deepest parts of the vein. The masons who built it claimed they were guided by dreams, visions of something that lived beneath the water, and whispered instructions in languages older than human speech. Margaret pressed her hand against the church wall, feeling moisture seep through stones that should have been dry as desert sand. The building had changed since the failed burning, becoming more organic, more alive. The wooden doors wept continuously now, their tears forming rivulets that ran down the steps and pooled in patterns that hurt to look at directly. "How do we get inside?" Samuel asked, eyeing the sealed entrance with the wariness of a man who had learned to fear doors that would not open. "The same way we tried before," Margaret replied, hefting the iron bar they had brought from the mill. "But this time we go deeper." The window shattered more easily than it should have, the glass parting like water before their makeshift tool. But as they climbed through the opening, the air that greeted them was thick and humid, carrying the weight of depths that had never seen sunlight. The interior of the church had transformed beyond recognition. Pews floated in inches of black water that reflected no light, and the walls ran with moisture that moved in patterns too deliberate to be natural. The 58 dead men stood in perfect formation before the altar, their mouths open in the eternal hymn that kept whatever lay beneath from rising completely. Their eyes tracked the intruder's movement, and Margaret could swear she saw recognition in Thomas's waterlogged gaze, a desperate plea for understanding mixed with the terrible compulsion that kept his voice bound to the song. But it was the altar itself that commanded their attention. What had once been a simple stone structure now pulsed with organic life, its surface rippling like water disturbed by unseen currents. The mortar between the stones had turned black and viscous, oozing substances that looked disturbingly like blood mixed with river silt. "There," Elijah pointed with a hand that was more scale than flesh now. "The keystone, the one with the carved spiral, that's where the seams are weakest." They worked with desperate efficiency, using the iron bar as a lever to pry at stones that seemed to resist their efforts with malevolent intelligence. The hymn grew louder as they worked, the voices of the dead taking on an urgent warning tone that spoke of barriers weakening and depths stirring to wakefulness. When the keystone finally shifted, it did so with a sound like breaking bones and gasping breath. Black water poured from the gap, thick with sediment and carrying within it the accumulated darkness of centuries. And beneath it, revealed by their labors, was a shaft descending into darkness so complete it seemed to have weight and substance. The well was lined with carvings older than the church, older than the town, perhaps older than human presence in the valley. Spirals and eyes and symbols that seemed to shift and move when observed directly, as if they were not mere decoration, but some form of living script that recorded truths too terrible for human comprehension. "To drown is to seal." Elijah read from markings near the well's mouth, his voice taking on the hollow quality of words spoken in vast spaces. "To breathe is to lose." Margaret peered into the shaft, and the darkness peered back. Far below she could hear the sound of water that was not quite water, moving with currents that followed no earthly law. And beneath that, almost too faint to detect, voices, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, all singing the same impossible hymn that bound them to eternal service. "The chain," Samuel whispered, pointing to iron links that descended into the depths. Their metal so corroded it looked more like bone than steel. Something was bound down there, something that broke free. Margaret's blood turned cold as she realized the implications. The well was not just a passage to some underground river, it was a prison, and whatever had been imprisoned there had been using the faith and devotion of the living to weaken its bonds, feeding on hymns and prayers until it grew strong enough to break free. But their examination was interrupted by a change in the air pressure, a sensation like diving too deep too quickly. The hymn of the dead faltered, their voices cracking with strain as something vast and patient began to stir in the depths below. Father Matthias emerged from shadows that had not been there moments before, his clothes streaming with water that defied gravity, his eyes reflecting depths that no living soul should have seen. "You should not have come here," he said, his voice carrying the authority of deep currents and older hunger. "The seals are weakening. Soon there will be no need for guardians at all." "What is it?" Margaret demanded, gesturing toward the well. "What lies down there?" The priest's smile was beatific and terrible, touched with the madness of someone who had stared into the abyss and found it beautiful beyond description. "The Father," he whispered, "the source from which all rivers flow. It has been sleeping in the depths since before your ancestors learned to build cities, dreaming of the day when it would rise and reclaim the world that was stolen from it." He spread his arms wide, and water began to seep from the walls, the floor, the very air around them. The 58 were not victims. They were the first of the new faithful chosen to guard the passage between the depths and the surface. But their voices grow weak. Their bonds strain against the power that stirs below. Soon it will rise, and all the world will know the blessing of the deep places. Margaret felt the pull then, the same seductive power that had nearly claimed her during the failed burning. The water rose around their ankles, their knees carrying within it promises of peace beyond understanding, of faith rewarded with eternal service to something greater than human comprehension. But Thomas's voice cut through the hypnotic hum of rising water, his words appearing in her mind with the clarity of a bell tolling through fog. "Choose silence, beloved. Choose the void over the song." She understood then what had to be done. The thing in the depths fed on voices, on hymns, on the willing devotion of souls who had been seduced by the promise of eternal meaning. To stop it, someone had to refuse that seduction, had to choose the silence of the grave over the symphony of the damned. The water reached her waist, then her chest, carrying with it the voices of all who had been claimed by the Father's vein. She could hear them clearly now, not just the 58, but the choir boys from 60 years past, and others, so many others, voices stretching back through centuries of faithful service to something that had never deserved their devotion. But she could also hear the warnings beneath the hymn, the desperate pleas of souls who had retained enough of themselves to recognize the horror of their situation. They were singing not from joy, but from compulsion, their voices bound to eternal service by bonds stronger than death itself. Samuel tried to reach for her as the water closed over her head, but Elijah held him back with arms that were more tentacle than human limb now. "Let her choose," the old man gurgled through lungs that had forgotten how to process air. "Let her make the choice that might free us all." Beneath the surface of the impossible flood, Margaret opened her eyes and saw the truth that lay at the heart of the Father's vein. It was not a river at all, but something far older and more alien, a presence that had existed in the deep places of the earth since before life had learned to breathe air instead of water. It had been sleeping, dreaming, waiting for the right moment to reclaim a world that had forgotten its dominion. The church had been built as both prison and feeding ground, a place where the faithful could offer their devotion to something they thought was divine. But their prayers and hymns had only served to weaken the seals that kept the ancient thing bound, and now those seals were failing. Margaret swam downward through water that was not water, following the corroded chain toward depths that defied measurement. Around her, the voices of the damned sang their eternal hymn, but she could hear the desperation beneath their devotion, the part of them that still remembered what it meant to choose. And when she reached the bottom of the well, when she came face to face with the thing that had been feeding on human faith for longer than history could record, she made her choice. She opened her mouth not to sing but to remain silent. And in that silence something ancient and terrible finally began to understand what it meant to be refused. The silence lasted only a heartbeat, but in that heartbeat, the thing in the depths tasted something it had not experienced in millennia: rejection. Not the sweet surrender of souls willingly given, not the desperate bargaining of the dying, but the simple, absolute refusal of someone who had seen its true nature and chosen to turn away. Margaret's silence rippled through the water like stone dropped in a still pond, and for a moment, just a moment, the eternal hymn faltered. The voices of the damned caught in their throats, their words of praise dissolving into bubbles that rose toward a surface that seemed impossibly far away. But the moment passed, and the thing in the depths roared its fury. The church bells began to ring with voices of brass and bronze and something else entirely, the accumulated screams of every soul that had ever been claimed by the Father's vein. The sound rolled across Dovermount like thunder made of anguish, shaking windows from their frames and sending birds falling dead from the sky. Margaret found herself thrust upward through water that burned like acid and tasted of centuries-old despair. She broke the surface of the flooded church, gasping for air that tasted of brine and shadow, her lungs aching as if she had been holding her breath for years instead of minutes. Around her, the 58 dead men had begun to move with new purpose. Their mouths still formed the words of the eternal hymn, but their eyes held a clarity that spoke of souls fighting against their bonds. They reached for her with hands that dripped river water, but their touch was gentle, almost protective, as if they were trying to shield her from something far worse. Samuel and Elijah were gone, swept away by currents that obeyed no earthly law. In their place stood Father Matthias, his arms spread wide in supplication, as the water around him began to glow with phosphorescence that hurt to look at directly. "You cannot refuse what you have already tasted," he proclaimed, his voice carrying harmonics that spoke of depths beyond measurement. "The Father knows you now, has touched your soul with its blessing. You belong to the depths, whether you accept it or not." But Margaret had learned something in her moment of silence at the bottom of the well. The thing that called itself the Father was not divine. It was simply older than human understanding, older than the concepts of good and evil that gave meaning to mortal existence. It had been sleeping in the deep places when the first humans learned to walk upright, and it would be sleeping there long after the last human drew breath. But it could be refused. It could be denied. And denial, she realized, was a form of power that the ancient thing had never learned to counter. The water began to rise beyond the bounds of the church, spilling out through doors that had sealed themselves shut, and windows that wept tears of liquid shadow. It flowed through the streets of Dovermount, like a living thing, carrying with it the voices of the damned and the promise of baptism in depths that knew no mercy. Margaret saw the townspeople flee their homes as the flood claimed everything in its path. Some ran toward higher ground, their faces pale with terror, as they abandoned possessions and memories to the hungry water. But others, too many others, stood transfixed as the flood reached them, their eyes taking on the glassy sheen of souls that had heard the hymn and found it beautiful. The widow Morrison stood waist-deep in the impossible water, her arms raised in welcome as her drowned husband emerged from the current to embrace her. Their reunion was tender and terrible, a moment of love corrupted by forces that had no understanding of human emotion. Jonathan Mills, who had led the mob against Margaret only days before, knelt in the rising water, with his prayer book clutched to his chest. His son, the boy who had been among the 58, walked toward him through the flood, his burial clothes streaming with phosphorescent water. When father and son embraced, their voices joined immediately in the eternal hymn, two more souls claimed by the depths. Margaret fought against the current, her legs heavy as lead as she struggled toward higher ground. Behind her, the Church of St. Bartholomew's was transforming into something that had never been meant for human worship. Its walls breathed with tidal rhythms, its spire had begun to bend and curve like something organic, and from its depths came the sound of hymns sung in languages that predated human speech. She found Samuel on the hill above the town, his fishing gaff clutched in white-knuckled hands as he watched his life's work disappear beneath water that reflected no stars. Beside him, Elijah sat with the patient stillness of someone who had accepted the inevitable. The old man's transformation was nearly complete now. Scales covered most of his body, and when he breathed, Margaret could see gills fluttering along his neck. "It's not winning," he told her, his voice bubbling through vocal cords that were learning to work underwater, the thing in the depths. "You hurt it somehow, down there in the dark. It's angry, desperate. That's why the flood is so violent, so chaotic. It's trying to claim everything at once, because it knows its time is limited." Margaret looked back at the town that had been her home, now transformed into a twisted reflection of some primordial ocean. The dead walked through the streets in perfect formation, their mouths moving in the eternal hymn that kept the ancient thing bound to its role as guardian and prisoner, both. But their eyes, the eyes of every soul that had been claimed by the Father's vein, held a desperate plea for freedom that grew stronger with each passing moment. "They're fighting it," she realized. "The dead, the ones bound to the hymn, they're using their voices to keep it contained even as they're forced to sing its praises." Samuel turned to her with hope flickering in his eyes like candle flame in wind. "David, my brother David, is he? He's still himself, somewhere beneath the compulsion. They all are. And they're trying to warn us, trying to tell us how to break the bonds that hold them." Thomas's journal, somehow still dry despite the flood, felt warm against her chest where she had pressed it for safekeeping. She pulled it out and opened it to pages that had been blank moments before, watching as new words appeared in her husband's careful script. The message read, forming letter by letter, as if written by a hand that was fighting against terrible pressure. "The shaft beneath the altar is the key. The ancient thing is bound there by chains forged from the faith of its first worshippers, people who recognized its true nature and chose to imprison it rather than serve it. But the chains are weakening, corroded by centuries of hymns that were meant to strengthen them, but have had the opposite effect." Margaret read the words aloud, her voice carrying across the flooded valley as more text appeared on the water-stained pages. "To break the cycle, someone must descend to the bottom of the well and choose silence over song, not the silence of the grave, but the silence of refusal, of absolute denial of the power that seeks to claim them. But the choice must be made willingly, with full knowledge of what it means. For in choosing silence they choose to become the final seal, the last barrier between the ancient thing and the world it seeks to reclaim." The words stopped appearing, but Margaret understood what Thomas could not bring himself to write. To save Dovemount, to free the souls bound to the eternal hymn, someone would have to sacrifice themselves. Someone would have to descend into the depths and choose to become a living seal, using their silence as a weapon against something that fed on sound and song and prayer. The flood was rising higher now, claiming the hill where they had taken refuge. In the distance, the bells of St. Bartholomew's rang with voices that were not quite human, calling the faithful to a baptism that would bind them to eternal service. And all around them, the dead walked through water that defied every law of nature, their mouths moving in harmonies that spoke of depths unmeasured and hunger, finally properly fed. But Margaret had made her choice. She had seen the thing in the depths, had tasted its alien hunger and recognized it for what it truly was, and she could not, allow it to claim any more souls. The question now was whether her silence would be enough to break bonds that had been forged in the earliest days of human civilization, or whether her sacrifice would simply add one more voice to the eternal hymn that rose from the depths of the Father's vein. Either way, she would face it as Thomas would have wanted her to, with courage, with love, and with the absolute certainty that some things were worth dying to prevent. The flooded church had become something from before creation, a cathedral built not for human worship, but for older, hungrier gods. Margaret waded through water that sang with voices of the damned, each step taking her deeper into darkness that had weight and texture and malevolent purpose. Beside her, Samuel moved with the desperate determination of a man who had nothing left to lose, his fishing gaff cutting through the liquid shadows like a sword through silk. The 58 dead men parted before them like a congregation, making way for pilgrims, their faces holding expressions of terrible hope. Margaret could see Thomas among them, his schoolteacher's features serene in death, but his eyes blazing with the fragment of soul that remained unbound. When their gazes met, she saw him mouth words that no voice could speak. "End it, please." The altar had been completely revealed now, its ancient stones weeping substances that were older than blood and hungrier than time. The well beneath gaped like a wound in the world, its depths glowing with phosphorescence that spoke of things that had never seen sunlight. And from those depths rose the sound that had been growing stronger since the first drowning, not hymns now, but something older, more primal. The birth cry of something vast and patient finally being born into a world it had coveted for millennia. Father Matthias stood at the well's edge like a priest at the altar of his God, his arms spread wide in supplication as water that was not water rose around him in impossible spirals. His eyes had taken on the same depthless quality as the dead, but unlike them, he radiated joy. The terrible, absolute joy of someone who had waited his entire life to witness the birth of his faith made manifest. "Behold," he proclaimed, his voice harmonizing with sounds that came from the depths. "The Father rises, the faithful shall be rewarded, and the world shall remember what it forgot when it chose air over water, earth over the depths." But even as he spoke, Margaret could hear the strain in his voice, the cracks in his certainty. The thing in the well was not the benevolent deity he had served all these years. It was hunger given form. Alien intelligence that had learned to wear the mask of divinity to seduce souls into willing servitude. She stepped closer to the well and the water around her began to glow more brightly. The voices of the dead grew urgent, their eternal hymn taking on the desperate quality of warnings shouted across vast distances. They could see what she intended, and they were trying to tell her something crucial. Samuel grabbed her arm as she reached the well's edge. "Margaret, no, there has to be another way." But she shook her head, her eyes fixed on the glowing depths where something vast and patient was finally stirring to full wakefulness. "This is the only way. The dead have been telling us all along. Someone has to choose silence. Someone has to refuse the song." The water rose around them as she spoke, carrying with it fragments of memory from every soul that had ever been claimed by the Father's vein. She saw flashes of the choir boys from 60 years past, their sweet voices raised in harmonies that had weakened the seals binding the ancient thing. She saw pilgrims from decades earlier, drawn by rumors of miraculous waters that could wash away any sin. She saw native tribes from centuries past, who had known the thing in the depths for what it truly was and had built their first prisons to contain it. All of them had tried to serve, to please, to appease something that could never be satisfied. All of them had added their voices to the hymn that was meant to be a binding but had become an invitation. Margaret understood now why the dead had retained fragments of their souls, why they fought against the compulsion that forced them to sing. They were the seals, the barriers between the ancient thing and the world it coveted. Their hymn was not worship but imprisonment, a chain of voices that kept something vast and terrible from breaking free entirely. But the chain was weakening. Each new voice added to it made it stronger in the short term, but more brittle in the long run, like metal heated and cooled too many times. Soon, it would shatter completely, and the thing in the depths would rise to reclaim a world that had forgotten its dominion. Unless someone chose a different path, unless someone chose silence over song, refusal over acceptance, the void over the hymn. Margaret filled her lungs with air that tasted of brine and sorrow, preparing for what might be her final breath. But before she could act, Father Matthias moved with desperate speed, his hands closing around her shoulders as he tried to pull her back from the well's edge. "You don't understand," he gasped, his fevered eyes wide with panic. "It needs you. It needs your voice, your faith, your willing surrender. If you refuse, if you choose silence, the seals will hold for another generation, maybe two, but eventually they will weaken again, and it will rise. Better to embrace the inevitable, to find joy in service to something greater than human understanding." Samuel's fishing gaff took the priest in the chest with a wet sound that echoed through the flooded church. Father Matthias looked down at the metal protruding from his ribs with an expression of mild surprise, as if he had never considered that his God might not protect him from earthly weapons. "I've served faithfully," he whispered, black water streaming from the wound instead of blood. "I've brought its souls, weakened the seals with every baptism, every prayer, every hymn. Surely that counts for something." But the thing in the depths had no concept of mercy, no understanding of gratitude. It was a hunger given form, and it fed on whatever was offered without consideration for the giver. Father Matthias fell backward into the well with a splash that sounded like laughter, his body sinking into phosphorescent depths that welcomed him with the same indifference they had shown every other soul. Margaret knelt at the well's edge and pressed her hands to stone that was older than human civilization. The carvings beneath her palms told a story that stretched back to the earliest days of the world, when things that were not quite gods walked the earth and demanded worship from creatures that were not quite human. The thing in the depths had been one of them, a presence that had ruled the deep places when the world was young and mostly water. But as the earth changed, as dry land claimed more territory and humans learned to build cities above the tide line, it had been forgotten, abandoned, left to sleep in caves and wells and underground rivers that grew smaller with each passing century. It should have died, should have faded into myth and legend like so many other ancient things. But it had learned to adapt, to wear the mask of human divinity, to seduce souls into willing service. The church had been built over its prison not to contain it, but to feed it, to provide a steady stream of faithful voices that would sing its praises and weaken the bonds that held it. But the bonds were not broken yet. The 58 dead men still sang their eternal hymn, their voices forming chains stronger than iron and more enduring than stone. They were prisoners, yes, but they were also guardians, using their enforced devotion to keep something far worse from breaking free. Margaret could save them. She could choose silence, refuse the song, add her will to the seals that bound the ancient thing. But it would mean becoming like them, not dead, exactly, but not alive either, a guardian spirit bound to eternal service, using her refusal as a weapon against something that fed on acceptance. The water around her began to rise more quickly now, carrying with it voices that spoke in languages older than human speech. The thing in the depths was growing impatient, eager to taste the soul that had dared to refuse it. It would feed on her silence, just as it fed on the hymns of the faithful, turning her defiance into another form of worship. But Margaret had learned something during her descent into the depths. Something that even the ancient thing did not fully understand. Silence was not the absence of sound, it was the presence of choice. And choice, freely made and stubbornly maintained, was the one thing that no alien intelligence could truly comprehend or control. She opened her mouth not to sing, not to scream, not to plead for mercy or deliverance. She opened her mouth to speak a single word that would either save Dove or damn it forever. No. The word fell into the depths like a stone dropped in still water, and the reaction was immediate and catastrophic. The thing that had been rising toward the surface recoiled as if struck, its alien consciousness encountering something it had no framework to process. Not worship, not fear, not even hatred, just simple, absolute refusal. The hymn of the 58 faltered, their voices cracking with something that might have been relief. For the first time in weeks, months, years, they had heard someone choose silence over song, refusal over acceptance, and in that choice, they found an echo of their own forgotten humanity. Margaret felt the pull then, the terrible seductive power of the depths calling to her soul. But she had made her choice, and she held to it with the stubborn determination of someone who had seen the true face of evil and refused to call it beautiful. The well began to collapse, its ancient stones grinding together as the thing in the depths thrashed in fury and confusion. Water that was not water poured upward in geysers that defied gravity, carrying with it the accumulated darkness of centuries. And through it all, Margaret held to her silence, her refusal, her simple and absolute no. The last thing she saw before the darkness claimed her was Thomas's face, his eyes bright with something that might have been pride, his mouth forming words that no voice could speak, but every heart could understand. "Thank you." Then the water closed over her head, and Margaret Hale descended into depths that would hold her silence for as long as the world had needed it. In the depths of the Father's vein, where water became something older than liquid and darkness took on weight and substance, Margaret Hale faced the thing that had claimed her husband and 57 others. It was vast beyond comprehension, alien beyond understanding, and it was scary. For the first time in millennia, ancient hunger had encountered something it could not digest, absolute refusal. Margaret's no echoed through the depths like a bell tolling in reverse, unmaking hymns and dissolving harmonies that had bound souls to eternal service. The thing writhed in its prison of corroded chains, trying to understand how denial could have more power than devotion, how silence could be louder than song. Around her, suspended in water that obeyed no earthly laws, floated the 58 men who had been claimed in the first drowning. But they were not as she had last seen them, bloated and waterlogged with river silt in their hair. Here, in this place beyond death and before life, they appeared as they had been in their final moments, desperate, terrified, but still fundamentally human. Thomas reached for her with hands that were warm and solid, his schoolteacher's eyes bright with understanding. "You came," he said, and his voice carried clearly through the impossible medium that surrounded them. "You chose to come." "I chose to refuse," Margaret replied, and her words sent ripples through the darkness that made the ancient thing recoil further. "I chose silence over song." But even as she spoke, she could feel the pull of the depths, the seductive promise of eternal service to something greater than human comprehension. The thing in the darkness had learned much during its long imprisonment, had discovered that fear and love were equally useful tools for binding souls to its will. It showed her visions of what could be Thomas restored to life, the 58 men walking free from their watery graves, Dove Mount blessed with prosperity beyond imagining. All it would cost was her voice, her will, her willingness to add her song to the eternal hymn that rose from the depths. "Join us." The vision, Thomas whispered, and his voice carried harmonics that spoke of depths unmeasured and hungers finally satisfied. "Sing with us, and we can all be together. Forever." But Margaret had seen the true face of the thing in the darkness, had recognized it for what it truly was, not a god or devil, but something far more alien and terrible. It was hunger given consciousness, need made manifest, the embodiment of every void that demanded to be filled. It had no understanding of love or mercy or sacrifice, only appetite, and the endless patient determination to feed. The real Thomas, not the vision conjured by alien will, but the man she had married and mourned, stepped forward with the other 57. Their faces held the terrible clarity of souls who had been forced to serve, but had never surrendered their essential humanity. "Don't listen," Thomas said, and his words carried the weight of hard-won wisdom. "It lies with truths, seduces with beauty, offers everything you've ever wanted, but the price is everything you've ever been." Margaret looked around at the assembled dead, seeing in their eyes the story of their capture and enslavement. They had come to the church seeking salvation, redemption, purpose. They had found instead a hunger that wore the mask of divinity, that fed on faith and grew stronger with every prayer offered in its name. But they had also found something else, the power to resist, not to escape. The bonds that held them were too strong for that, but to refuse to surrender the core of what made them human. They sang the hymns they were compelled to sing, but they kept alive the memory of what they had been before the water claimed them. "We are the seals," the man who had been Jonathan Mills said, his voice echoing with the authority of someone who had learned truth through suffering. "Our voices bind it, keep it from rising fully into the world above, but the bonds grow weaker with each soul it claims, each voice it adds to the choir. That's why you retained yourselves," Margaret realized. "The more it tries to claim, the thinner its control becomes. It's spreading itself too thin." The ancient thing pulsed with fury at her understanding, sending waves of pressure through the water that would have crushed any mortal form. But Margaret was beyond mortality now, sustained by something stronger than flesh and bone, the absolute certainty of her refusal. "I will not sing," she declared, and her words fell into the depths like stones that would never reach the bottom. "I will not add my voice to your choir. I choose silence, not as surrender but as a weapon. I choose the void that you can never fill." The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The thing in the darkness recoiled as if burned, its alien consciousness encountering something it had no framework to process. The hymn that had bound the 58 for so long began to crack and splinter, their voices breaking free from the compulsion that had held them. But freedom came with a price. As the bonds weakened, the ancient thing began to rise, its vast bulk pressing against barriers that had contained it for centuries. If it broke free entirely, if it reached the surface world, it would not need individual souls anymore. It would simply consume everything, turning the entire earth into an extension of its hunger. Margaret understood what had to be done. The 58 had been prisoners, but they had also been guardians, using their enforced servitude to keep something far worse contained. If they were to be freed, someone else would have to take their place. Someone would have to become the final seal, the last barrier between the ancient thing and the world it coveted. "Go," she told Thomas and the others, her voice carrying the authority of absolute love. "Return to whatever rest awaits beyond this place. I will hold the line." But Thomas shook his head, his eyes bright with the same stubborn determination that had made him a good teacher and a better husband. Not alone, never alone. The other 57 men moved to stand beside him, their faces set with the resolve of souls who had found their purpose at last. "We were prisoners," Samuel's brother David said, his voice carrying across the dark waters. "But we choose to be guardians, not because we are compelled, but because we are willing." Together, they began to sing. Not the hymn of slavery they had been forced to voice for so long, but something new, a song of choice, of sacrifice freely made, of love stronger than death, and determination deeper than any earthly well. Their voices wove together into harmonies that spoke not of submission, but of defiance, not of worship, but of protection. The ancient thing thrashed against these new bonds, but they held firm, not because they were forged of compulsion and fear, but because they were freely given, chosen rather than imposed. The difference between slavery and service, Margaret realized, was the difference between a chain and a shield. She added her silence to their song, her refusal becoming part of the harmony that held the darkness at bay. She would never leave this place, never return to the sunlit world above. But her sacrifice, their sacrifice, would ensure that the ancient hunger remained bound, contained, prevented from consuming the world that had forgotten its existence. Above them, far above, in the flooded church of St. Bartholomew Serres, the bells fell silent for the first time in weeks. The water that had defied every natural law began to recede, flowing back toward the Father's vein with currents that carried with them the debris of a nightmare finally ended. The townspeople of Dovemount emerged from their hiding places to find their home transformed, but recognizable, cleansed but not destroyed. The church stood empty now, its doors hanging open to reveal pews dry as bone and an altar cracked down the middle. The well beneath was gone, filled with stones that wept no moisture and sang no impossible hymns. Samuel Whitcroft found Thomas's journal on the steps of the ruined church, its pages white and clean, as if nothing had ever been written in them. But as he watched, words began to appear in familiar handwriting, not messages from the dead, but a record of what had transpired in the depths. "We are the guardians now," the journal read, its pages filled with careful script that spoke of sacrifice and service freely chosen. "Not prisoners of the depths, but protectors of the light. The ancient hunger sleeps again, bound by chains forged, not of compulsion but of love. It will wake someday. Such things always do, but not in our time, not in the time of our children's children. We have brought the world another age of sunlight, another era of forgetting." The final entry appeared as Samuel watched. Written in a hand he recognized as Margaret's careful script. "Tell them we are not lost. Tell them we chose this, and in choosing we found something the darkness could never understand, the power of absolute refusal, the strength of perfect silence, the victory that comes from saying no to things that should never have been worshipped in the first place." The journal closed itself with a sound like water lapping against distant shores, and Samuel tucked it carefully inside his coat. Someday he knew someone would need to remember what had happened in Dovemount, what had been sacrificed to keep the ancient hunger bound. But for now it was enough that the sun was shining again, that the river ran clear, and that the bells of St. Bartholomew's would never ring with voices of the damned. In the depths of the Father's vein, where silence had become a form of prayer and refusal, had transformed into worship, Margaret Hale and the 58 men stood guard over darkness that would never again see light. They sang their chosen song, wove their willing bonds, and held the line between the world above and the hunger below. And they would hold it for as long as love endured, as long as choice had meaning, as long as someone was willing to say no to the things that whispered seductively from the depths of every human heart. The Father's vein flowed on, carrying with it the memory of sacrifice and the promise of protection. And in the town of Dovemount, life began again, under skies that had forgotten the taste of drowning, blessed by guardians who had chosen silence over song and found in that choice the only victory that truly mattered. In the deep places where water becomes something older than liquid and darkness takes on weight and substance, they wait, not as prisoners now, but as willing guardians, their voices raised in harmony that speaks not of submission, but of defiance, not of worship, but of protection. And in their chosen song, in their willing sacrifice, lies the only truth that matters, that some things are worth guarding against, and some silences are louder than any hymn. The river remembers as rivers always do, but now it remembers love as well as hunger, choice as well as compulsion, the sound of absolute refusal echoing through depths that thought they had heard every song worth singing. And in that echo, in that silence made sacred by sacrifice freely given, lies the hope that darkness can be held at bay, not forever, but long enough for light to find its way back to places that had forgotten what it meant to choose.